Thank you, Angie. Good morning, everybody. I'm Cleyvis, and I am your instructor for the art of fiction. Today is our third class, second to last class, and we're going to be focused on plot and escalation. So I prepared a little 5-minute writing prompt that's going to come in handy for your writing prompt at the end. So I'm gonna just share my desktop. Let me see if I can do this. Share. And let's see, we wanna do full screen. Can you see the full screen? All right. So what we're gonna start with, I took a craft class at the MFA program where I teach. They have this master series lecture, and one of the people that came to speak to us last academic year, was Amy Hempel, who's an extraordinary short story writer. And she gave us this prompt, which I actually thought was fantastic. So I'm sharing it with you now. We're gonna take the first 5 minutes of the class or until 12:10. And I want you to just take the 5 minutes and just write down questions. So questions that keep you up at night. And the way I want you to do this is to take the first 5 questions and have them be questions that you would willingly share in public if you were asked. And then write 5 questions that you would never tell anybody. And this should be the questions that torment you. Like at night when you can't sleep and you have like this running list of things in your mind, these are the questions that I want you to write down. So let's do that for 5 minutes. We'll come back into the room at 12:10 and then we'll start a regular class. Hey JP, how are you? We're starting the class with a 10-minute 5-minute prompt. It's just writing down questions, so the prompt is there on the screen. Okay,
Thank you.
and we'll come back at 12:10 from it. All right, this is just a quick exercise. So let's come back into the room. Does anybody have any of their questions for public consumption you'd like to share?
I think one I return to often in my work is what does healing look like? I
What?
can't. What does healing look like?
What does healing look like? I love that question.
Hi, I could share one. A question that I'm asking myself every day is like, what does success looks like to me in
Mm,
my at 34?
mm.
How does life look like to me at 34?
No, that's a big stakes question. You guys aren't bringing any lightweight questions on the Sunday morning. That's great. Anybody else want to share any questions?
Hi. Sometimes I wonder, like, if I'm just sort of like a collection of thoughts and feelings that I've observed, or if I've ever had any like original thought or feeling that I haven't observed.
Mm, are we original? Are we just copies of the things we absorbed around us? That is very deep, I have to say. I mean, I don't have any answers, obviously. So the exercise, the exercise helps us to identify some of our obsessions. And I think, in the last two classes, I've spoken a little bit about how important I think it is and how helpful it can be to our work for us to deeply excavate to find out what are our primary concerns on this planet as artists. I think there are a lot of, like I would say, as writers are getting more comfortable and learning how to find their voice and like what their concerns are, it's wonderful to have range, right? So I'm not one of those people that aspires to have every story I write sound the same. I actually like trying on different styles, and depending on what I'm trying to do with the story, I like to really deeply inhabit my character's consciousness. So to me, it doesn't make sense that everything I write would sound the same. But I know that there are some writers who are very highly stylized, and they do want to have that consistency. And so, regardless of where you stand in terms of your narrative voice, the one thing that I think there's been like pretty consistent agreement is that most writers are pretty much writing the same story over and over again. It might come up dressed a little differently each time, but in its heart, the central question often remains the same. And this doesn't mean that you necessarily are always wrestling with the same set of actions or events, or that you're always visiting the same character in the same way, but that there's a way in which this obsession, this question that we might have as artists or as humans, inhabits the world of our characters and becomes a concern in the world. And then as you become more experienced, you intersect it with different things. So this question of like, what does success look like to me as a 35-year-old? I think there's a whole genre of stories coming of age which wrestles with this same idea. Like, who are we? How do we come what we're meant to be? Um, and if you intersect that with class, with culture, with gender, you can see how that question can change and morph over the life of the writer. There are some writers who are really obsessed with death or with just lots of things. Like, what do you think Nana, Kwame, Adeji, Brenya is obsessed with at least from the story Finkelstein 5? What might be one of his obsessions?
What's up, yeah? My question, I think, was getting at his obsession, which might be my obsession too. I'm doing a lot of projection here, but like, is decolonization or liberation always a violent event? Which is like, if you read Franz Fanon, he'd say, yeah, it is a violent event. That question around violence, is it is decolonization or liberation a violent event?
Can we be free by any means other than the means that have been used to enslave and colonize us? Is there another path to liberation and freedom? I definitely think that's a big theme in this story. What else would you say? Like, what else would you say is present in this story as potential paths to understanding the writer's obsessions?
I thought for me, I was just so, yeah, definitely I can see like the obsession with like justice and freedom. But I felt like with Emmanuel, like the main character, is constantly asking like, can't I just be me? Like, can't I just be?
Can I just be me? Can I just be free? What is getting in the way of his freedom? What do we find out pretty much in the first 2 or 3 paragraphs about Emmanuel?
His Blackness, or like the way that he is perceived. I think there was also the sort of question about perception and constantly having to filter yourself or know how you're being perceived. And then that sort of like relationship between like your own self-expression in relationship to like how the world sees you, and that constant like policing of self, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Nana, if any of you have not read this collection, Friday Black, I would strongly encourage you to read it. It is a collection of stories that looks at race in America in like, a lot of people call Nana a surrealist or fabulous writer. Some of the short stories are quite, I would say, like middle of the road. They're, you know, the plane from which he's writing, it's quite normal. Some of them are quite surrealistic, especially the titled story, Friday Black, which is another one of my favorites. Today we're gonna talk about Escalation. So Finkelstein 5 is a great story for the purposes of today's class, but I also love teaching Friday Black. Whenever I teach like magical writing, that's one of my favorites. So some of you might have already heard me read from it. Anyway, I would suggest, if you're really interested in seeing how a writer kind of wrestles with questions, I think this collection is a really great collection. Because I think a lot of the stories, you can see them wrestling with this idea of freedom, of the individual in like a society that is corrupt, you know, corrupt because of capitalism, corrupt because of enslavement, because of racism. And it's just really well done, you know, even though I should have warned you all, and I apologize, because I usually do content warnings when I'm teaching these stories, which are, you know, so violent. But, you know, I think that this is a really good example of what we're going to be talking about today. So let me just give you like one final word about obsessions. I think our obsessions find their way into our stories, and we talked about that a little bit last week. You know, for me, I started wrestling with my obsession, which is really grief and loss, probably when I was 7 years old. You know, my mom left the Dominican Republic when I was 7, and we didn't see her. I don't know for how long, maybe a year or maybe a year and a half. But for a little girl that's 7 years old, that felt like my whole life, you know? Thank you, Lila. Then when I was 10 years old, we left the Dominican Republic and I left my father. We left him behind. He chose not to travel with us. And so that was like a series of kind of dealing with parental separation again. So by the time my father died when I was 18, I had become like a full-blown expert because I had been thinking about loss. And these are not things that I would have articulated as a 7-year-old or a 10-year-old or an 18-year-old. But certainly by the time that my father died for real, I'd had all these other types of losses. Like he lost his memory. So at a certain point, he didn't even know who I was when I spoke to him on the phone. It was devastating when I was 15 years old for my father not to recognize me anymore. So when I started writing like the writers that I really admire, which were Stephen King and Anne Rice. Those were the stories I was obsessed with in high school, and a lot of romance novels where like a lot of sexy stuff happened. But interestingly enough, when I finally got to college and, right as my father died, I took my first creative writing class with Stephen Milhauser, which like, in a way, I think I just transplanted my love for my father to this white writing teacher, which to this day, like I still see him and I'm in touch with him. But it was interesting because when I started writing, I just kept writing about people dying, like people kept dying in my stories. And I was like, what the hell's wrong with me? And like the stories got better over time, but I was like trying to resist it. I was like, what's wrong with my imagination? Why can't I think of something a little more interesting that just people? And then I would start writing something that's completely different, and then eventually somebody would end up dying in the story. And it took, and I would say it wasn't probably until I really by the time I was 22, I started writing a novel, which I intended. And I was like, I'm just gonna give into it because this is something that keeps haunting me and keeps showing up. And like, I would say like the central question that I wrestle with a lot is like, what happens to a human being after they lose someone important? Like, or what does grief do to human beings? How does grief transform human beings? So to me, like that's a central question of that first, like my thesis in my MFA program. And the book that I sold is again another book that its central concern or the central issue that's eating at one of my main characters is loss. So, the one thing that I will tell you about my own journey with wrestling with my obsessions is that, like, I think there's something that happens inside each of us as we discover what we're obsessed with and we give into it, which is also like something quite beautiful, that the world starts opening up in these interesting ways. And you start noticing like this central obsession because you are an expert. Like most of us, if you're thinking about like what does success look like, what is the impact of the society on me as a human being, am I really myself, or am I a conglomerate of other people's desires and opinions and ambitions? These are probably questions that you've been asking yourself since you were, believe it or not, a child. And there are things that probably like push you to like think very deeply in some ways. And so just keep digging. I also think that the secret questions, which you would never share with people, I find those to be like a wonderful source of like fodder for your writing. So like give like these shameful, secret, outrageous, wonderfully delicious, sinful questions to your characters. One of the things Amy Hempel said in this brilliant lecture that she gave to the students was, that she ended up divorcing her husband because of one of these questions that she kept wrestling with. And like her characters kept divorcing their spouses until she was like, all right, guess I gotta divorce this guy because this is what things are pointing me to. Hopefully it won't be that dramatic for you with your questions. But this idea that like this thing that torments you and keeps you up is something that torments and keeps up your character. And you start with the question at the beginning. That is the inciting incident for that story. So, hopefully the 10 questions you wrote, 5 for public, 5 for private. If you didn't get to write all of them, I would invite you to do this exercise on your own. Like these 10 ideas, these 10 questions, these 10 torments are each a seed for a story that you could write. And for many of us, we don't just have one obsession. Many of us have many obsessions. And so what I would encourage you to do is to like very intentionally write into that and write from that place. And I think you will find that the richness and the depth of the observations you already have in your subconscious will shock you, both with its honesty, if you allow yourself to be honest, but also with its beauty, So these are things that we've all been probably thinking about most of our lives, if we are honest with ourselves. So today we're going to, well, let me pause before I move on. Does anybody have any questions or comments to make about that, about obsessions and questions and how they can help enrich our stories? No? Okay, vamos para adelante entonces. So today we're going to be talking about plot and structure. And why did I start with questions? We're going to be talking about plot and structures. I like to think about plot as a series of questions that get answered throughout the story. There are some folks, especially if you're working on a novel, people talk about like, why do people keep reading? Like what's the thing that propels a reader to continue? It's kind of the same question we ask in short stories. Why should somebody invest their time? Or why do people stop reading a story? Why do they lose interest? And more often than not, it is related to whether or not there's tension in the story, whether or not the characters are interesting and memorable, whether the situation you put your characters in is revealing of something of deep importance or revelation for people. So, so we'll keep bringing this idea of questions and how it comes up, but I'm gonna go through some slides like we do every week, just so that you guys can have like an understanding of how we think about plot and structure, narrative structure in the literary tradition, and then how we can break away from that, depending on what we want to do. And then we'll talk about Finkelstein 5 and how we see plot and structure working, in the service of character transformation. And then we'll do like our writing prompt, which is the third part of our short story that we're writing together. And then we'll share at the end. So that's the plan for today. Okay, so plot, I did a search. The last semester when I was teaching like first year MFA, I actually gave them an essay that I really like. But the essay is very long, so it's not an essay that we would read in a 4-week course. But I'm happy to send it to any of you if you're interested in more information. It's something that I can definitely make available to you. So I just did a search, honestly, like this week on Google, and I went around until I found something that I liked, that I think is helpful in how we think about plot. And so a lot of times people, you've likely heard or will hear in your life as an artist, people talk about plot and talk about whether plot is good or plot is bad. There are some people who think that if you are a serious writer, you will not be concerned with plot, and that stories that are plot driven are less valuable than stories that are character driven, which means that they're more concerned with the character's interiority or the language of the story itself. So the line by line thinkers. And so I personally don't think these things are at odds with each other or mutually exclusive. Like, I think that in order for stories to work, something really interesting should be happening. The characters should be memorable. There should be a sequence of events or actions that lead to the character transformation. I think that the plot itself needs to be kind of pushing us toward this, the question that is asked at the beginning, and it needs to be pushing us through it. And everything that happens, which at times for writers can feel so daunting, but everything that happens in the story is intentional. So every single thing that happens, everything that is said, every character that a character runs into or from, should lead us to this moment of transformation, which should be like the point of the story, right? And so, I find this description helpful, and I hope you do too. I'm not gonna read it to you because I've had it up here. But it's just about that, like sequence of action, the actions of the characters, what leads to transformation. So for those of you who, who have taken some of my classes, I'm gonna go through this a little quicker because I think most people have like seen this before. And for the benefit of your understanding, I want you to think about like plot and narrative structure as two separate concepts. At least for me, this helps me. And then escalation, which we're really going to be talking about today, is a tool that enables the plot and the narrative structure to function or to work to its like ultimate benefit. So, the slide before, we talked about plot as being a series of interrelated events or actions that lead to the transformation of the main character. That's my that's kind of like my definition, and I took the picture that you're seeing here from this blog. Now Novel is a writer. I don't know who the writer is, but I thought this was a really helpful image. So plot itself is like the action of the of the story or the novel, like the actual events that happen in it. That's plot. The narrative structure is the design. So if I asked you, which I will in a minute, like what is Finkelstein 5 about, you would say to me what the story is about. It is about Emmanuel, who is a young Black man in America. And these are the things that happen. If we talk about narrative structure, then we're talking about the shape of the story, how information is given to us. And in Finkelstein 5, something really interesting happens, the choice of the writer, because Nana decides to tell us within the first 2 pages of the story what happens during this court case, where 5 children have been decapitated by this insane person. And what's interesting about it is that we find out what happens to the 5 children. We find out how this community reacts to it. We find out how Emmanuel reacts to it. And then in meticulous sections, we see that play out. So if we talk about the narrative structure, there's kind of like 2 or 3 different strings. I would call it kind of like a braided structure, where one structure is Emmanuel going from point A to point B, which is the main character's journey. And then we have another strand, which is the courtroom scenes, which we already know. So we're moving through time, and it's not happening linearly. So like Emmanuel's story happens linearly in real time. We're pretty much following him, right? And then the other part of it, which is the court, we're kind of starting from the end and then working our way back from the ending, because we already know what happens. So we kind of start at the end of that, and then we work our way back from the beginning of it all the way through these really kind of crazy scenes. So when you think about like Freytag, a lot of people actually give Aristotle the kind of like think of Aristotle as the father of like what we consider to be like modern plot structures. When you think about novel structures of like 3 acts, where like, in the beginning, we get introduced to a situation, in the middle, something very dramatic happens, and in the end, everything is resolved. And resolution doesn't mean necessarily that everything is tidied up. It means that like the themes and all of the concerns are brought to an ending, brought to a close. So for today's class, I want you to think about like what we talked about in the last few classes. We talked about, this part here, like the exposition or the beginning of a story. which is usually where we find out what the inciting incident is, or what is different about this day for this character. Then, you know, today we're really gonna be talking about rising action and falling action. That's what we're gonna be talking about when we talk about the escalation, how we deal with escalation, and then how we bring the escalation down. And then, you know, for next week, we'll be talking about setting. And when we talk about setting, like I like to think about, it's just the way that is helpful for me as a writer, but I like to think about how everything works together. But we'll be focusing more on resolution during our last class. But you know, for the sake of today's class, I mean, plot is really the whole of it, the whole thing. It's everything that's happening, every action that happens that brings us from the beginning to the end. Does anybody have any questions about plot or narrative structure or escalation? Let me stop sharing. Everybody's clear about what we're talking about? What is plot? What is structure? Okay, all right. So let's keep going then. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the art of escalation. So when you think about escalation, one of the things that amazes me is how often when I read stories by writers who are kind of early on or starting out, like nothing happens in the story. And it's sometimes like, you know, what I like to think about, like a contemplation versus a reckoning, or like some kind of series of events where like something happens at the beginning and then there is a transformation, but we don't clearly see the steps between how that transformation happened. And so for me, I think it's really important for us as writers to understand like what makes people want to keep reading. And to me, like deeply embedded in our desire as readers is our expectation that things should be moving, and that they should be moving in ways that are visible to me as a reader, that sometimes delight and surprise me, but that also delight and surprise the character. You know, things that reveal as much to me about that character as a reader as the character themselves. Because as the character is, you know, being, you know, if you think about plot, it's almost like the story is pushing against the character's want. It's like the character wants, you know, in Finkelstein 5, what does Emmanuel want? Like, what is his very basic desire that, like, we see him pretty early on in the story voice? What do we know that he wants? People are writing in the chat. Can I see the chat from here? I don't know if I can. Oh, let's see. A job.
Yeah,
Thank you, people. Thank you, Sonia. He wants a job, you know? And I had mentioned to all of you that it's like really important for you to give your characters something that they want that's really obvious to the reader. And so this is what he wants. He wants a job. And, you know, the plot of the story, you know, if we think about it as like what's happening, what's the connective tissue? How do the stakes keep raising and raising and rising and rising? What happens is that like the whole world is pushing up against Emmanuel wanting a job, you know? If you think about that phone call that he gets from the person, I mean, it's kind of like the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. This is an urban store. The manager tells him, we already got like 4 of you guys here. So I'm so sorry, I don't want to waste your time. And he thinks he's being a nice guy. He's like, you know, I just don't want to waste your time. But I realized your last name after I hung up the phone with you. So we understand, like, within the first few pages of the story, like what he wants, what is the inciting incident? What would you say is the inciting incident in this story? What is the thing that has changed everything? Yes, the verdict. What do we know happened? Who can give us like what is the story about? Tell me what the story is about and why does the verdict matter?
Uh, it turns out a white man was with his son and daughter. I think in a store, the library, I can't remember exactly. And then these three black young people approach him, and then it escalates. Then essentially he ends up like using a chainsaw, he decapitates them, kills them, and the story starts off with Emmanuel just reflecting on that, and his parents reacting to it, and the writer keeps putting weight on that with like little details, like saying like I think something to the effect like the mother doesn't react a lot, but when it came to this verdict, the mother reacted to it, so little by little piles on. Um, and while we're learning that Emmanuel wants to get a job and he goes out to get clothing for the job interview or whatnot, we're getting more and more detail about the court case and the defense's case, the prosecutor's case. And while that's happening, then this old childhood friend Boogie is introduced. He's on the bus, dressed really well. So while Emmanuel's journey to get this job interview, the court case proceeding, and then Boogie, like little details, these three things keep like moving the story forward. And yeah, that's the setup. If anybody else wants to continue.
Yeah, I mean, that's the setup, right? The setup is we're dealing with a story where, I mean, everything seems, you know, he's waking up from a nightmare. So we know from the first section that he's being haunted, tormented by a little headless girl named Phila. And, you know, then everything that JP said. So what we're gonna do today is that we're gonna be spending, I mean, I wanna spend maybe the next 30 minutes like really deeply looking at the story and how it functions. And the purpose of that is just to show you how escalation and plot work together toward transforming the character by the end of the story, okay? So what we know about this character is that he's Black, and what do we know about the way that race has been indoctrinated into his consciousness? Like what was his father telling him when he was very young about what he needed to know?
I'm not sure what you're referring to with what the father was saying, but I think there was this theme throughout the story of him sort of giving himself his own rating of like, he was right now at a 2.0 out of a 10-point scale. And there was like this constant way that he was presenting himself in different circumstances because he knew how like the outside world was perceiving him. So he like always knew, I guess, how to sort of repress or like police his Blackness. I think there was that scene when he went to the zoo and he was accused of stealing something, and
Panda, he doesn't even like panda people. He's accused of stealing a panda.
Yeah, and I think it was like his father said that we just like they have to learn how to deal with that from a young age, but I don't quite remember what the thing was.
Yeah, so his father tells him we have to learn how to move. It's important for you to learn how to move. You know, to be safe, we have to learn how to move. So we're being introduced into this world where, you know, Emmanuel has to police his tone, the way he moves through the world, and that means what he looks like in terms of how he's dressed, the way that the world reacts to him. And we can see evidence pretty quickly. As soon as he leaves his home, what happens? How do people react to him at the bus stop? They're scared. Thank you. People react to Emmanuel like he's a criminal just because he's walking. He hasn't done anything. And when he turns his hat around, two people all of a sudden, I have my notes here. Two people all of a sudden find out they have somewhere very important to be. Whatever it is very funny. Who else laughed reading this story? I mean, it's terrifying, but it's also, did anybody else find humor in the story or no?
I found, I mean, again, like it's some serious humor, right? But the fact that when he's about to, I think he leaves, he compares himself, or the writer compares Emmanuel to Evil Knievel, like a stunt man risky. He's just going out into the world, and he's like, he's Evil Knievel at the ramp, about to like perform in a lot of way, but in that performance, his life is at risk, and that this double consciousness which just collapses on itself.
Yeah, I mean, there are these moments where the absurdity of what he's up against is hilarious. I mean, absolutely, Yadi. Like, the story is very surreal, but also these moments aren't surreal yet. I mean, this is very recognizable to any of us that are like Black and brown people making our way to the world. People get uncomfortable, people get up and walk away from us. Like, all we're doing is trying to breathe and trying to get to the mall to buy a shirt. And all of a sudden, you know, everybody's up and out. And so then he runs into, so the first thing that I want you to be conscious of is that we're giving, early on in the story, we are given pretty explicit information about this world where like a white man with a boy and a girl can take a chainsaw to 5 children, 5 Black children. Finkelstein is the library. 5 is the number of the children who are murdered. In the very first page and a half, we find out he got off, he got acquitted. So this is not a writer that is gonna take it easy on us. We already know pretty early on that we're gonna be dealing with some pretty horrific situations here. And we have Emmanuel, who seems like a pretty, like, how would you describe him in the scenes, in the first 3 scenes, like including the one where we run into Boogie? Like, what happens on the bus when he gets on the bus, he sees one of his friends. He notices that like in the past, anytime he hung out with this friend, he like had to dial his blackness out because this guy's super black, blackity black, right? So like Boogie's like righteous, but Boogie's dressed like, you know, really well. And what do we find out through the interaction? Let's first talk about what happens in the bus. What's the first thing we find out about Boogie? Like, what is the memory that Emmanuel has of what the two of them used to do? Do you remember like what they used to do in school?
They used to help each other like cheat on exams, I think it
Cheat.
was.
Cheat. Okay, so far the characters we've seen are the mother, who's usually the happiest go lucky person in the neighborhood, who is so hurt and outraged that she throws a plastic cup across the room. It's not even her house, by the way, because then they get in a car and go somewhere. So we know this person is like devastated. The father, who we would say most of the time, right? It's like masculinity rules. Toxic masculinity rules would tell us a father crying is a pretty big deal. So this is like the second reaction that we're seeing from the community. People are devastated. Everybody's mourning these children. And then we see Emmanuel get into a bus. We see the whole world react to him like he's a criminal when all he's trying to do is breathe. And then he runs into his friend. And what we know about this friend is that as children, they cheated on tests together. So we already have a sense of like who Boogie is. So what happens during the bus ride?
we learn about this thing that's going on called naming, where the outrage from the verdict resulted in just groups of people who were, I guess, just tired of the injustice. And they're going around dressed up in like these very like formal clothing, and I guess sort of like inciting the violence against, I think, white people. With like their target was white people, as they were like naming the one of the 5 people who were kids who were murdered by the guy.
So for those of you that have not read the story, I would say I would encourage you to read it, because it's a really good story for you to understand this concept of escalation, okay? Where we start out is with this old school friend, and the two of them knew each other because they would do stuff that would get them in trouble. So no surprise here that Boogie is involved. Before Boogie then explains to Emmanuel that this naming is happening, and what it entails is people dressing up and going out into the street and killing white people. So there's a naming situation going on, and by the end of the bus ride, Boogie does what? What does he invite Emmanuel to do? Right? To join in the naming. Are you down? Are you ready to move with us? Another really important thing that happens in the thing before, because then Boogie, right before he gets off the bus, names one of the children and like then commits an act of violence against someone who's minding their business on the bus. She's a white lady sitting by the window. But before that happens, what's the story that Boogie tells Emmanuel that his uncle told him? And why do you think it's important that Boogie says this story about what the uncle says? The rest of you that are hiding from me, you don't have to hide just because you didn't read the story. It's okay. I'm not gonna get you in trouble for not reading. I know everybody's busy.
I read the story, but the part where the story about falling asleep on the bus, his uncle tells, I actually didn't understand exactly what he was trying to say, because he's saying if the old man falls asleep and leans on you and you push him away, that was wrong. But then if he is just asleep on his own and he happens to lean on you, that was a different outcome. And I actually wasn't really clear on it.
What do others think is happening in that part of the story? Does anybody have some insights for Rachel? What do you think Boogie is trying to say? So, I think a lot of what the story is concerned with is community too. Like a big theme is the idea of what happens to a community that's under siege. And so when Boog is telling the story, what he's saying is, what we're being encouraged to do is if another Black person, and he's being explicit that there's a brother, like a brother, another Black man is sitting next to you. If he falls asleep on your shoulder, you're supposed to push him off you because he's not supposed to like lean on you. If he falls asleep on his own and somebody comes and robs him, too bad for him. That's not your responsibility. And what Boogie's uncle was saying is that actually that your brother is your responsibility. We shouldn't let people get robbed just because they're not our concern. And so Boogie comes with this kind of radical idea about being part of a community and taking care of each other, waking up. And really, we're gonna pick up the pace because we don't have a lot of time, but what he wants Emmanuel to understand is that this naming, like the violence that's happening, is following this idea of taking care of each other in the community. We're under siege. Now it's our turn to go and take care of each other. And the way we're gonna do this is that we're gonna go and kill white people because they're killing us, right? And so the beginning of what I would say is the first beat of the escalation in the story is that invitation. How does Emmanuel react the first time when he's invited to like do the stuff?
I thought Emmanuel was hesitant. I didn't see, I mean, it's almost like conflict. You could see it happening in his head as he's trying to decide, you know, I've really changed. I pulled away from Boogie. Boogie hasn't changed, except now he's dressed differently. So I think you actually feel and see the conflict within Emmanuel trying to figure out how he needs to react and what he should do. Because, I mean, he is the one that calls 911 after Boogie flees the bus. So I think it's all conflict for him until that point where something happens to him. And you talked about it earlier, where he gets the phone call from the employer who says, don't bother coming. And then I think, and I could be wrong again, but I think things start to change for Emmanuel. Everything starts to pile up on him. He starts to understand he does need to be part of this.
Yeah, I mean, you know, if, go ahead, JP, what were you gonna say?
No, it was that if you look at Emmanuel, like he's constantly struggling with being himself, right? Being just being, because he's Black becomes something negative, being himself, but he's by himself. Is only with Boogie in the past, where he's in a collective or in a group because he's cheating on the test. And then in when he joins the naming gang, the naming crew, that's the only time when he's in a collective. But in every other point, it's just he's on his own, he's by himself. And he's forced to, like, essentially make, like you're saying, you need tension, you need conflict. He's forced to make a choice. And what's interesting is that early on in the story, when he's about to go out, because of the verdict, he decides to dress a certain ways in solidarity. But the way he's performance on the other end, like I'm wearing this. And ironically, Boogie's dressed really well, but he's dressed really well because he's about to cause violence. So how the writer's turning that on its head. But just the original point where sort of like Emmanuel's a single person by himself, and is only with Boogie that he's in the collective. He's part of the collective, whether he wants to be part of the collective or not.
Right. I mean, and if you think about that fork of the choices that we make as a human being, so there's a lot of things that are happening in this day that are gonna determine what's gonna happen to Emmanuel for his entire life. So what we know from the first beat, from like that nightmare, from the first section, if you look at it carefully, the first 2 or 3 sections, we like pretty quickly understand that like the stakes are life and death in this story, okay? Like the stakes just don't get higher than that. And so when you think about like how we are invited into the world and into the consciousness of this character, we do understand that he's in a very lonely, and I would say like lonely isn't even the right word, it's isolated. He's very isolated in his Blackness. He polices himself. He's doing everything he's supposed to do. The minute he gets out in the street, people think he's about to be robbing them, stealing their bags, shooting them, right? Like people are expecting from him this kind of violence that doesn't exist in Emmanuel. Rachel was right. Emmanuel's hesitant because Emmanuel's not a violent person. Emmanuel did not steal the panda that he was accused of stealing when he was in middle school. Okay, Emmanuel's like a straight and narrow guy. So when we see this first moment where Boogie's inviting him to commit crimes and like horrible crimes, I mean, we're talking about people are dead by this naming that's happening. So this is no joke. Like, this is not like people pranking each other. This is like serious. We see him resist. So the first beat, the first beginning of what I'm gonna tell you is kind of the plot of the story. I consider the action of the story that leads to his transformation starts with him rejecting, with him making a phone call to the police, with him calling for help for this woman that has been assaulted. And the minute he does this thing, which reminds us of Emmanuel's humanity, everybody starts looking at him real suspicious. Like, and he already can envision. And what does he envision in that moment? We're still in the first third of the story. What does he envision on the bus when people start looking at him?
People accusing him, pointing their fingers at him, and the police arriving and shooting him.
Shooting him. He very clearly envisions himself ending up dead because he's helping. And what does he do? He made the phone call, but he gets the hell out of Dodge. He's like, I'm out of this bus. You know, he leaves the bus. So I'm going to share a few tips, because what I want you to think about in your own stories, because today's exercise, guess what? It's about escalation. So what part of the prompts I've been giving you have created an escalation to begin with. Hopefully by now you realize that. There's a lot of conflict. There is emotional issues at stake with the stories that you have been drafting. And so now I want you to think about, how do you manipulate the interconnected action so that it is a rising? The tension rises as the action rises in the story. So I'm just gonna give you some tips of like how I do it. So I don't know if you can see this, it might be tough, but the way that I think about points of escalation and how you can use this in your own work is to consider what the beginning point is for your character. Stories are concerned with many different things, among them emotional, spiritual, physical matters of concern, central concerns. And one way that I think about, and I do this in my own story, is that with each beat, so you think about what's happening in the story, like each beat that moves the story forward needs to show us in a way that this situation, whatever that beginning point, is going to be magnified, is going to deteriorate, or is going to heighten in really clear and pointed ways, so that the reader understands there is movement within the chosen theme, right? For me, like and if you, any movie buffs here, like if you're a movie buff, this is really obvious in movies, because this is how, like in plot, in movie plots, this is very obvious how it works. Is you just ask yourself, what's the worst thing that can happen? What is the worst thing that can happen to the character in this moment? So think about Emmanuel. Emmanuel is just minding his business, finally gets a phone call for a job that he wants. He puts on an outfit where he's no longer gonna pretend to make everybody else comfortable. He's mourning and he's angry, but he's gonna go and buy himself a nice button-down shirt for the interview because he's no fool. He wants his job. So he gets on the bus, he runs into a childhood friend that's kind of a troublemaker. And the childhood friend tells him, we're out here killing people. I want you to join us. Emmanuel resists. But the environment around him, he can see very quickly that like people already think of him as a criminal. People have dehumanized him. And so that is the starting point. Now from that point, what is the worst thing that could happen to Emmanuel? I mean, as a writer, think about the two paths you have. If you're Nana writing the story, Emmanuel could get the job, or Emmanuel could not get the job. What happens in the story? We already talked about it. I mean, like, he doesn't even get interviewed. His blackness stops him from even being considered. He's stopped before he gets. So like the emotional beat then is what? Like, what do you think is happening emotionally to Emmanuel?
I think he starts to sort of unravel. Oh, sorry, Sonia.
Go ahead.
I just think he starts to sort of unravel.
Yep. Yari says anger, absolutely. Unravel, we feel him, right? Unraveling. Sonia, what do you think?
I was just thinking that like as the story escalates, so does his anger. Or he's, even though he's like a straight and narrow person, like there's like details that let us know that he has anger in him for very justified reasons. And so as the story pushes him, like he just gets like that anger starts to come out.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I usually spend 3 hours on this story, which we can do today. we would under different circumstances, you can do it by yourself, is that we would chart what happens at each beat of the story and how it both magnifies, intensifies, so that it can only make sense. Because when you are told you cannot even come into an interview because this is an urban store and we got too many of you already, like what's a character gonna do except go with Boogie and release some of this anger? Now, what's really important though is that like the second beat is not, Ellie, I don't think he surrenders quite yet, right? Because before he leaves his house, what do we know? He grabs a bat, and what happens with the bat? He doesn't take the bat, he leaves the bat, right? So we know that he's ready to go, he's angry, but he's not ready to take a weapon. We don't see him at a point where he's there yet. So the second beat is him deciding to go, but choosing not to take a weapon. So that's what I mean. When you're like thinking about plotting, like each of your beats in your story, you have to be really deliberate about like how far is your character going? Like how much are you gonna push them? What do you make of what happens next? Now we have to just wrap up talking about the story because I want you guys to have some time to practice. What happens next? When you think about the beats that get us to that very dramatic ending.
After which point? I'm sorry.
So he decides that he's gonna go with Boogie. So like what happens after he leaves his house to go meet up? He gets to a place where Boogie is, the girlfriend is there. There's a guy who's a teacher. There's another tiny man that's there. So
I think the sister, the woman says something to the effect like, "Who are we doing this for?" Like, I think that they focus on a name, like what name are we gonna make them say? Remember that point?
And what name did they pick?
Forget.
Do you remember?
Was it Fela? No. I think Fela, not Fela St. John.
Fela. And if we remember at the beginning of the story, Fela is
the name.
Yeah, Fela is
That's
the
name
one.
he says.
Thank you, Rachel. Fela is the one that is tormenting. So now again, it's a way in which we know, if you think about the beats, this is a further beat because Fela is the one that has been tormenting him in his dreams. This child has been coming to him headless. So at that point, what do you expect? When you were reading this story, what did you think was gonna happen in the story? Do you remember what your expectation was of the story? What did you think might happen?
I was afraid that because he was so careful about policing himself and always being that very like respectable, like in terms of like respectability politics, he was like on top of his game for that. And then I was just afraid that he was going to get killed anyway, even after trying so hard. I wasn't expecting him to, I guess, surrender to his anger at the very end, to the point where it all just comes like floating out. But then at the same time, it does kind of make sense, especially with the escalation of like, it was almost like this tension of he continued more and more to try to like hold it down, that when it finally popped, it like exploded. So it makes sense, but my expectation was that he was going to be like another victim even after like trying his best to do all the right things according to like what people believe the right things are, to avoid the kind of violence that is incited.
Yeah, I mean, the story is like a really dreadful story. I mean, the first time I read the story, this is the first story in the collection in Friday Black. And I remember the first time I read the story, it's an enjoyable, if we can call it that, because it really, you can't, once you start reading, you're like, what is gonna happen to Emmanuel? I mean, he's been holding it down, and then this is the day when everything changes, because this is the day that will change his life forever, right? So yeah, so I think that's really important for us to know. And Emmanuel has the bat, right? So Emmanuel, we see Emmanuel have a moment where that conflict that Rachel was talking about before, of his anger and his frustration, is in conflict with his humanity. And like on page 24, there's a moment where he screams, I don't know what to do. And like, what does he do instead of like hitting the two white people? Do you remember? Anybody?
He attacks Boogie.
He attacks Boogie instead.
Yeah.
What did you make of that? What do you think? What's happening?
Um, there's a number of things, right? Because it's while at the same time we could use words that he surrendered, he failed in some way. Um, the way I'm thinking of that, because you explicitly asked me that question before I go off on a tangent, is there's something it's because of the double consciousness, right? Because he's constantly thinking about the white gaze and how the world is perceiving him. That's what led and for it, that's what led to the backfiring and sabotaging the collective, right? Whether the collective goals were good or bad, depending on your morals, like that's something else. But the collective um had a real goal, which was we are going to attack these white people for XYZ. Um, and it was Emmanuel's internalization of the white gaze that I don't know what to do because he wanted to be split. If he had gotten, and this is like one thing I'm getting out of this, like, of course, the escalation, but you don't have this escalation in these beats if it's not so efficient. Like everything matters, every detail, it's all leading to this point. Even the getting shot in the head, the fact that everything's leading to that point. um and that's what I'm getting at. Like that's what I got out of it, and that's what I got it at that moment, how efficient it was. That point, I don't know what to do, I don't know. And then attacking Boogie, it clearly shows he doesn't know what to do, and yet it makes perfect sense that he would do that. As soon as because there's the external want early on, the job, and then the internal want, which is justice. Once you take the job away, it was almost like, what's gonna fill that void? And then Boogie comes in to fill that void. um and what I got from that point, when I reached that point, patient, I was just like, God, like this writer's super efficient, because it all, like, everything I read before this is leading up to this point. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Um, so we're not gonna. So at this point in my conversations, I usually spend some time kind of breaking down the scenes, like how we are emotionally affected and how that builds up. But I think you can do that work on your own. Reread the story and really think about the ways in which the writer, like what JP is talking about, is like the construction of the scenes, and the ways in which everything that's happened, is coming to this moment of this climax, which is he wants to live, he wants justice, but he also wants to stay alive. I mean, everything that we've been seeing all along is him learning how to move his body so that it's not a threat to other people, so people don't think he's a criminal, so people don't kill him. And not people, the police don't kill him. So here we are in this moment, right, where like everything is at stake, and he hits his friend Boogie instead. So when the police finally come, this is the moment. And in this story, it's one of the stories that's really easy, and it's a really good story to teach to writers. For those of you that will do what I do and turn around now that you know how to break down stories, and you're gonna teach other writers how to break down stories. You know, like when you think about the map of the Freytag's map of the climax, I mean, like we at the beginning understand that the climax of the story has to intersect with race and has to intersect with mortality because the story is concerned with death, right? And so when Emmanuel gets to a 10, that's the climax of the story. I mean, like, in case you missed it, people, this is the moment where everything, right? Like every moment has been coming to this moment. And what happens at the climax of the story? What happens to Emmanuel?
Everything he thought wouldn't happen happens, or everything he was trying to avoid in his life happens. And that vision he had of what would happen to him on the bus when he was calling 911 happens at the end. And the description's pretty incredible at how the writer sort of tells us what happens to him and how he sees himself, and he sees the explosion and the blood. And in the other part, what was really interesting, before he goes after Boogie, the woman says the name of the little girl, Fala St. John. And I loved how, I mean, we start with Fela, and it's interwoven throughout the whole story. And then right before he has the interaction with Boogie at the end, the woman says her name. I mean, it's a story you have to read, I think, multiple times.
It is. I mean, Fela is like a really great source of like the emotional weight. And Fela is what like reminds, I would argue, that Fela is the one that reminds Emmanuel of his own humanity, right? Emmanuel is not a killer. Emmanuel is not a criminal, you know? And both within his community and outside of his community, people keep wanting to make him that. And that's not who he is. But ultimately, the story is telling us that in the context of this world where he moves through, it doesn't matter whether he's a criminal or not, whether his intentions are good or not. So that moment, we talked about point of view before. So why do you think the writer chose the point of view that the writer chose? When we spent time talking about POV, we said, you know, there needs to be a point in the story where like it becomes clear to us that the story could not be told in any other point of view. Does that hold true for this story, or do you think the story would have had the same impact if it would have been told in a different POV?
I know I keep repeating the same shit, but it's like the fact with the double consciousness, like the close person third, it works so well. Like, and again, this is after the fact, and like listening to everyone's comments, it works so well, just because that double consciousness shows that there's a self-awareness there when it comes to the blackness meter, and yeah, this lack of awareness at the same time. Whereas like your point, like no matter what he does, it's the fact that he's black is the crime. Like his being is criminalized, not his actions or whatever. So there's this lack of awareness there. Where sort of like, but there's also this awareness that he's monitoring his blackness with the scale at the same time, and the close person third like allows for that, you know, in an interesting way where you see a little bit more, but you can't see too much because then you'd be telling too much. Yeah, I don't know if that answers it, but that's from
It does. I mean, it does. You know, I think that it is part of it is showing the conflict, which I don't know how you could pull that off in a first person point of view. But also, Sonia, you know, there's like a really logical reason. I mean, he dies at the end of the story. So like, you know, unless you're gonna be telling a story where like it's already like this writer is not interested in telling a story that is a ghost story, right? The root of this is that it's an exaggeration of the reality that we live through. And I would argue not that much of a stretch these days. So the third works because he won't be around to tell the story. He's gonna die, you know? But so like inside the story, there's a reason why the POV is chosen. I just don't want you to lose sight of that. Collectively and cumulative, what we're learning, like the story has to make sense in the form. And then the last thing that I want you to think about, which we haven't talked a lot about and we don't have time for it, but like what is up with like the court scenes? I mean, we already know that what the findings are. And I wonder what you think the purpose and the function of the court scenes are for the story. What does it do in the story?
I'm going to respond as a reader. It just kept making me angrier and angrier and angrier as I read it. And it really made me start to understand Boogie and what they were trying to do and sort of that conflict. And I mean, it's terrible violence, but the more you read about how he just, was it Dunn, who had this total disregard for human life? And he's just so willing to sit there and say, my life is more important, my kid's life is more important. In my mind, I saw that my life was in danger, which you know it's not. So as a reader, I just kept getting angrier and angrier and thought the court scenes were really important to keep that tension and to keep me engaged and to keep me wanting justice at the end.
Yeah, I mean, you know, something that happens here, and Celeste, earlier in the chat, Celeste has said, you know, whiteness gets acquitted from their violence again. And all of us, right, have had moments where, maybe all of us, maybe not, but like most of us have had moments where we feel angry, like we feel mournful, we feel pain at like the injustices that happen in our society. Like, but you know, oftentimes there is this kind of level of like complexity where it's like, oh, but the person was doing something wrong. Like the person was kind of like a criminal, you know? So one of the things that's really important in this story is that like Nana's not giving us an out. These are 5 children who were at a library, okay? Like you cannot get more innocent than that. And so it does function, like Rachel said, the function of every single scene, how incompetent, you know, like the prosecutor is, how conniving the defending attorney is. The idea that like it doesn't even matter that he killed these children. No, it also functions interestingly as a way of telling us like the polarization, because we find out the way that like newscasters are talking about these children. And then it gives us a really interesting point of juxtaposition when like Black people start killing white people and like how they are framed, right? So all of it is supposed to function, and the emotion that should be elicited. I mean, Nana was very purposeful that the emotion he wanted to elicit from us as readers is anger. He wants us to get to a point where we do think that the way through for Emmanuel to be free is to kill a white person. Not that it would be the right thing or whatever it is that we think, but this character gets to a point where it is justified in his own consciousness based on all these kind of mounting moments. So by the end of the story, I think this is one of the most well-crafted short stories that I've read in recent years. And I'm always looking at fiction through the lens of social justice. So like, which are the stories that make us think and, you know, are true reflection of the society we live in, that reflect and like give us insight into what could happen to a person, right? That may look different than us. And so I think it's really a brilliant story. And at the end, it's like his humanity that both saves him and dooms him, right? So it's kind of like gorgeous. I think Rachel was saying that it's really incredibly striking and beautiful, and also like tragic and horrible, and all of the things happen in that one paragraph. Because in a way, like that's what we expected to happen in the story, right? Like we expected that no matter what Emmanuel chooses to do, he's gonna end up dead. And it happens and we're kind of devastated. Anybody else want to say anything about this short story as an example of how action builds in order to facilitate the transformation of the character? Or how escalation can aid in helping the reader follow along with that transformation?
I think what I liked about this story is that like the escalation or tension is twofold, right? You have the inner tension, right, of the man and what he's gonna do and like, how he's reacting to everything. But then as y'all have said, right, it's the external tension, like what's happening around him in society that, like as you pointed out, Cleyvis, is happening because we're also getting like reports of like the trial. And so there's like multiple levels of tension working at the same time to the same point, to the same end point. So I think that was brilliant.
Yeah, steal it, steal it. I'm telling you, like I have a lot of like exercises that I do for myself whenever I'm feeling like not as inspired or I'm feeling a little bit kind of stuck. I mean, I don't really believe in writer's block because I can always write even if it's not very good. But to write something that I feel like gets closer to me wrestling with my obsession, I get a lot of inspiration from writers. And so like this story helped me to write, you know, a story. I wrote a story in reaction to the story. And so like that's something that you can do too as writers, is that if you find people who are kind of interested in your obsessions, and our obsessions aren't that unique, even though we think we're very unique. Like you're gonna find a lot of people who are writing stories that intersect with like your interests, and it's a wonderful thing, you know. I read Everything Inside by Edwidge Danticat, which is like that story I wanted to use for our last class, but it's like an 80-page story. I'm not gonna do that to you. I'm gonna try to find a shorter one. But I gotta tell you, yeah, it's like a novella for real. But there's like something that happens in my brain when I encounter a story where like I'm like, oh, you're doing something interesting, but I'm in deep disagreement with how you're doing it, so I'm gonna try to do it too. And you can copy the structure. You can have characters. You know, for the sake of this one, like the prompt that I usually give my students is to like try to write a story in reaction to the story. For today, I want you to like keep writing the story you're writing. So that's not what we're gonna do. But for your own time and in your own interest, try it. When you read something that like is really moving or strikes you, one of my students wrote like about an older woman, you know, who's like pressure is, you know, she's feeling this kind of pressure like Emmanuel, but about being aging and about, you know, being in a female body. And it was really brilliant. So just like, you know, that's kind of like part of like us as miners, mining and excavating other people's work is taking this, you know, taking inspiration and also like learning, like, you know what, if you have this kind of two thread thing and one of them is something that's like really showing us the external world, and then one of them is like internal, almost claustrophobically close to the character, like look the way those two things work together to like even raise the tensions more, like Sonia said. Okay, so we're at 1:30, and what we're gonna do is that I'm gonna give you all 20 minutes to write into your story. So if it makes sense for you to continue on with what you were working on, I would prefer that. But also if you got inspired to do something different, this is your time. I want you to use it. This is what I came up with for our next prompt. So like this will be the third section of the story that we've been writing together. And the first one was where one person is going to do something and then the other person prevents them from doing it. The second one was where like time has passed and we said we wanted a lot of time to pass, like years. And these two people are again together and they are forced to confront what happened and how both of them are probably wrong in their assumptions. What I'm interested in doing today is kind of like adding a little bit more of a depth to the story. And so I want you to consider like what has been revealed about the character in the first and second sections. And so like I want you to think about it like in terms of the way we've been talking about it. Like, is the escalation in your story one that's like emotional? Is it something that's a situation where like someone had asked a question about like a crime kind of based plot, and it's like, is it like clues, you know, to a crime that needs to be solved? Like, what kind of situation are we dealing with here? And what is the natural way that like this next step is raising those stakes? The other thing that I really want to invite you to think about is like, what are, from the questions that we asked, we started at the beginning of the class, what are the obsessions that you recognize in the story you started writing? Do any of the questions that you put in there pop up to you as you revisit that story or now as you contemplate it? If none of them are there, I want to invite you to put one in. And you don't have to start from the beginning. You can do it just in this section. Reveal to us something really important about the character's obsessions or questions, or like what torments the character. And I want that to be connected to what obsesses and torments you as a writer, and write from that place. Okay, we're gonna come back at 1:50, and whoever wants to share can share. Yeah, okay, I'm gonna put it in the All right, writers, it's time to come back. We got, I think we have most people back. So today we focused on plot and escalation. We talked about how we can string together in a really intentional way the action that is happening to our characters so that it all works on a scale where the reader can see how the stakes are rising as the action is rising. And whatever happens on the other side of the climax is also connected to the action as an escalation or as a point of de-escalation or resolution. So I'm curious to see if anybody wants to share what they wrote. Anybody? You guys got so shy since last week. What happened? Everybody just wants to go outside. It's a beautiful day. You're all like, what are we doing here? Anybody?
I can go.
Okay.
So it's not a lot because I spent a lot of time just thinking and didn't have a lot of time to do the actual writing. But I'll start here. It says, did you kill me? Maciel asked. In your world? Emma stated her truth. No. Although she always wondered whether the version of her that lured Maciel into that house that night did. She preferred to think that the person she saw, embracing Maciel as the door closed behind them, simply took her hand and walked her into a reality that far surpassed the one they were in, that they were happy there, that there was no ill intent from the Emma who took her, from the Emma who took her Maciel. And maybe that's why she didn't continue searching for her, why she didn't just up and leave when she met this one. Yeah, that's it.
So what did you incorporate from, did you incorporate any of your questions from the earlier exercise?
Yes, it was this sort of question of what one is capable of. Sort of like questioning the guilt that people might feel or the shame and the justifications. So like there's this sort of like split consciousness of thinking you're a good person, but then also wondering if there is something in you that will or did do something wrong. So that's what I was sort of I guess grappling with there, and also like the different versions of a person that can exist, and sort of like which one are you tuning into currently, is I think what is going through Emma's mind.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, listen, this idea of each note or step or beat in an escalation needs to tell us something about the character, like reveal character. So we talked about how through like dialogue, you can reveal the character to us. This is another way in which you can reveal. Like you can think about it in the way that each beat when like the story is pushing against the character's wants, you know, there's like this kind of external, and I like the way JP talked about it before. Like, you know, you have kind of this external want, which is, I want a job, but there's like also this very personal one, which is usually something really complicated, right? Belonging, fulfillment, accomplishment, success, love, you know, all these things. So, you know, I think it's really interesting when characters surprise themselves with revelations, because for me as a reader, it's so satisfying to like find something out as the characters finding it out, or having something revealed to me. You know, like I was thinking Emmanuel's such a goody goody, but then when I found out he was cheating, I was like, maybe he is capable of doing some ratchet shit. And think about how that is a beat in escalation, because if you really thought he was incapable of doing it and it wasn't believable, it would, there's no tension if you don't think he actually might get to a point where he could kill somebody. But like just that little seed, like tells us all we need to know about Boogie, and also raises the stakes, because all of a sudden we know that Emmanuel is capable of doing something wrong, even if it's something tiny, like showing a friend a test. So, you know, I think that anytime that you can create that complexity within your characters and like reveal to us in this kind of elegant way, it's intelligent to like give it to us in that way. And I love that this is very cerebral what you're working on, because I feel like this idea of like different selves and who do you tune into depending on the situation is really great.
Yeah, this was the first time that my character even asked herself if she did kill somebody. It's a little, like the story itself is a little complicated in terms of like realities and different universes, but this is the first time that I think the reason it counted as a beat for me was just because you're forced to grapple with this question about yourself of like, did I do that? Did I do something wrong? When this whole time the character is sort of rationalizing in their head that what they're doing is right. And there's like a monster within that they don't even have access to.
Yeah, I mean, give me the film rights. That sounds great. I'm like, I'll buy the ticket. I think that's really interesting. And again, like anytime that you can complicate, I mean, that's a way that we complicate characters and make them memorable too, is to like have them go through something that they can't, if the action creates within the character this sense of newness, right? Because that's what we're dealing with. It's like situations that characters haven't been before, and they're forced to like make choices. And like, of course, it would reveal something new that they wouldn't know because they've never been in this situation before. So it's logical that they would learn something new as we're learning something new. And it's also very satisfying as readers. All right, well, I'm not gonna torture you guys anymore by putting you on the spot and being super quiet until somebody gives in and reads from their work. Hopefully today was helpful. I know talking about plot, some of this stuff is so mechanical that it can feel kind of clunky to talk about it, and like deconstruct these stories I know can feel a little tedious, but it's really helpful on your way to learning how to put stories together and learning how to like build action. And I think I said this to you before. I mean, all my professors in my MFA program spent a lot of time, incredibly helpful, amazing people, but I never knew what a plot was. Like, I feel like I never really understood how to like make a story move. I just had my characters going through a lot of shit, and at the end, something really wonderful happened, you know, or something crazy happened, or something surprising happened, and they were transformed. But when I had to take a step back and really look at stories that I loved and be like, oh, this is how they're doing it. Every character in the story and every situation is building toward this climax. It just kind of opened up something in me where I was like, oh, this is how you build a story, so that there's like an internal logic to the story itself, even if it's wildly different from the way the world works, but it makes sense for this character and the journey they are on. So thank you for sticking with me today. I appreciate you all on this beautiful day. Happy Father's Day. JP, I think you're the only one that came today. That's a dad. So happy Father's Day today. Happy Father's Day to all of you that might be in a parenting role doing all the things. And I hope that you come next week. It'll be our last week. I'm going to try to find a really good story for us that shows you how we manipulate the setting. And so next week, we're going to be talking about finishing stories and how we use setting as another device, craft device to like elevate our story. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week. Have a great day. Have a great week. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.